Chapter 41 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Millward. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 41. The Eve of the Trial. An upper room in a dull Stoniton street, with 2 beds in it, one laid on the floor. It is 10 o'clock on Thursday night, and the dark wall opposite the window shuts out the moonlight that might have struggled with the light of the one dip candle by which Bartle Massey is pretending to read, while he is really looking over his spectacles at Adam Bede, seated near the dark window. You would hardly have known it was Adam without being told. His face has got thinner this last week. He has the sunken eyes, the neglected beard of a man just risen from a sick-bed. His heavy black hair hangs over his forehead, and there is no active impulse in him which inclines him to push it off, that he may be more awake to what is around him. He has one arm over the back of the chair, and he seems to be looking down at his clasped hands. He is roused by a knock at the door. "There he is," said Bartle Massey, rising hastily and unfastening the door. It was Mr. Irwin. Adam rose from his chair with instinctive respect as Mr. Irwin approached him and took his hand. "I'm late, Adam," he said, sitting down on the chair which Bartle placed for him. "But I was later in setting off from Broxton than I intended to be, and I have been incessantly occupied since I have arrived. I have done everything now, however, everything that can be done tonight, at least. Let us all sit down." Adam took his chair again mechanically, and Bartle, for whom there was no chair remaining, sat on the bed in the background. "Have you seen her, sir?" asked Adam tremulously. "Yes, Adam. I and the chaplain have both been with her this evening." "Did you ask her, sir? Did you say anything about me?" "Yes," said Mr. Irwin with some hesitation. "I spoke of you. I said you wished to see her before the trial, if she consented." As Mr. Irwin paused, Adam looked at him with eager, questioning eyes. "You know she shrinks from seeing anyone, Adam. It is not only you. Some fatal influence seems to have shut up her heart against her fellow creatures. She has scarcely said anything more than no, either to me or the chaplain. 3 or 4 days ago, before you were mentioned to her, when I asked her if there was any one of her family whom she would like to see, to whom she could open her mind, she said with a violent shudder, 'Tell them not to come near me. I won't see any of them.'" Adam's head was hanging down again, and he did not speak. There was silence for a few minutes, and then Mr. Irwin said, "I don't like to advise you against your own feelings, Adam, if they now urge you strongly to go and see her tomorrow morning, even without her consent. It is possible, notwithstanding appearances to the contrary, that the interview might affect her favourably. But I grieve to say I have scarcely any hope of that. She didn't seem agitated when I mentioned your name. She only said no in the same cold, obstinate way as usual. And if the meeting had no good effect on her, it would be pure, useless suffering to you. Severe suffering, I fear. She is very much changed." Adam started up from his chair and seized his hat which lay on the table. But he stood still then and looked at Mr. Irwin as if he had a question to ask, which it was yet difficult to utter. Bartle Massey rose quietly, turned the key in the door, and put it in his pocket. "Is he come back?" said Adam at last. "No, he is not," said Mr. Irwin quietly. "Lay down your hat, Adam, unless you like to walk out with me for a little fresh air. I fear you have not been out again to-day." "You needn't deceive me, sir," said Adam, looking hard at Mr. Irwin and speaking in a tone of angry suspicion. "You needn't be afraid of me. I only want justice. I want him to feel what she feels. It's his work. She was a child, as it'd have gone to anybody's heart to look at it. I don't care what she's done. It was him brought her to it, and he shall know it. He shall feel it. If there's a God, he shall feel what it is have brought a child like her to sin and misery." "I'm not deceiving you, Adam," said Mr. Irwine. "Arthur Donnithorne is not come back, was not come back when I left. I have left a letter for him. He will know all as soon as he arrives." "But you don't mind about it," said Adam indignantly. "You think it doesn't matter as she lies there in shame and misery, and he knows nothing about it. He suffers nothing." "Adam, he will know. He will suffer, long and bitterly. He has a heart and a conscience. I can't be entirely deceived in his character. I am convinced. I am sure he didn't fall under temptation without struggle. He may be weak, but he is not callous, not coldly selfish. I am persuaded that this will be a shock of which we will feel the effects all his life. Why do you crave vengeance in this way? No amount of torture that you could inflict on him could benefit her." "No, oh God, no!" Adam groaned out, sinking on the chair again. "But then that's the deepest curse of all. That's what makes the blackness of it. It can never be undone. My poor Hetty, she could never be my sweet Hetty again, the prettiest thing God had made, smiling up at me. I thought she loved me and was good." Adam's voice had been gradually sinking into a hoarse undertone, as if he were only talking to himself. But now he said abruptly, looking at Mr. Irwine, "But she isn't as guilty as they say? You don't think she is, sir? She can't ha' done it." "That, perhaps, can never be known with certainty, Adam," Mr. Irwine answered gently. "In these cases we sometimes form our judgment on what seems to us strong evidence, and yet, for want of knowing some smaller fact, our judgment is wrong. But suppose the worst. You have no right to say that the guilt of her crime lies with him, and that he ought to bear the punishment. It is not for us men to apportion the shares of moral guilt and retribution. We find it impossible to avoid mistakes, even in determining who has committed a single criminal act. And the problem, how far a man is to be held responsible for the unseen consequences of his own deed, is one that might well surely make us tremble to look into it. The evil consequences that may lie folded in a single act of selfish indulgence is a thought so awful that it ought surely to awaken some feeling less presumptuous than a rash desire to punish. You have a mind that can understand this fully, Adam, when you are calm. Don't suppose I can't enter into the anguish that drives you into this state of revengeful hatred. But think of this. If you were to obey your passion, for it is passion, and you deceive yourself in calling it justice, it might be with you precisely as it has been with Arthur. Nay, worse, your passion might lead you yourself into a horrible crime." "No, not worse," said Adam bitterly. "I don't believe it's worse. I'd sooner do it. I'd sooner do a wickedness as I could suffer for by myself than have brought her to do wickedness, and then stand by and see 'em punish her while they let me alone, and all for a bit of pleasure, as if he'd had a man's heart in him. He'd ha' cut his hand off sooner than he had taken it. What if he didn't foresee what's happened? He foresaw enough. He'd no right to expect anything but harm and shame to her. And then he wanted to smooth it off with lies. No, there's plenty of things folks are hanged for, not half so hateful as that. Let a man do what he will. If he knows he's to bear the punishment himself, he isn't half so bad as a mean, selfish coward makes things easy to himself and knows all the while the punishment will fall on somebody else." "There and again you partly deceive yourself, Adam. There is no sort of wrong deed of which a man can bear the punishment alone. You can't isolate yourself and say that the evil which is in you shall not spread. Men's lives are as thoroughly blended with each other as the air they breathe. Evil spreads as necessarily as disease. I know. I feel the terrible extent of suffering this sin of Arthur's has caused to others. But so does every sin cause suffering to others besides those who commit it. An act of vengeance on your part against Arthur would simply be another evil added to those we are suffering under. You could not bear the punishment alone. You would entail the worst sorrows on everyone who loves you. You would have committed an act of blind fury that would leave all the present evils just as they were and add worse evils to them. You may tell me that you meditate no fatal act of vengeance, but the feeling in your mind is what gives birth to such actions, and as long as you indulge it, as long as you do not see that to fix your mind on Arthur's punishment is revenge, and not justice, you are in danger of being led on to the commission of some great wrong. Remember what you told me about your feelings after you had given that blow to Arthur in the grove." Adam was silent. The last words had called up a vivid image of the past, and Mr. Irwine left him to his thoughts, while he spoke to Bartle Massey about old Mr. Donnithorne's funeral and other matters of an indifferent kind. But at length Adam turned round and said, in a more subdued tone, "I've not asked about 'em at the Hall Farm, sir. Is Mr. Poyser coming?" "He is come. He is in Stoniton to-night. But I could not advise him to see you, Adam. His own mind is in a very perturbed state, and it is best he should not see you till you are calmer." "Is Dinah Morris come to him, sir? Seth said they'd sent for her." "No, Mr. Poyser tells me she was not come when he left. They're afraid the letter has not reached her. It seems they had no exact address." Adam sat ruminating a little while, and then said, "I wonder if Dinah had gone to see her. But perhaps the Poysers would have been sorely against it, since they won't come nigh her themselves. But I think she would, for the Methodists are great folk for going into the prisons, and Seth said he thought she would. She's a very tender way with her, Dinah had. I wonder if she could have done any good. You never saw her, sir, did you?" "Yes, I did. I had a conversation with her. She pleased me a good deal. And now you mention it, I wish she would come, for it is possible that a gentle, mild woman like her might move Hetty to open her heart. The jail chaplain is rather harsh in his manner." "But it's of no use if she doesn't come," said Adam sadly. "If I'd thought of it earlier, I would have taken some measure for finding her out," said Mr. Irwine. "But it's too late now, I fear. Well, Adam, I must go now. Try to get some rest tonight. God bless you. I'll see you early tomorrow morning." End of chapter 41.
Chapter 42 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Ashworth, Brisbane, Australia. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 42. The Morning of the Trial. At 1 o'clock the next day, Adam was alone in his dull upper room. His watch lay before him on the table, as if he were counting the long minutes. He had no knowledge of what was likely to be said by the witnesses on the trial, for he had shrunk from all the particulars connected with Hetty's arrest and accusation. This brave active man, who would have hastened towards any danger or toil to rescue Hetty from an apprehended wrong or misfortune, felt himself powerless to contemplate irremediable evil and suffering. The susceptibility which would have been an impelling force where there was any possibility of action became helpless anguish when he was obliged to be passive, or else sought an active outlet in the thought of inflicting justice on Arthur. Energetic natures, strong for all strenuous deeds, will often rush away from a hopeless sufferer, as if they were hard-hearted. It is the overmastering sense of pain that drives them. They shrink by an ungovernable instinct, as they would shrink from laceration. Adam had brought himself to think of seeing Hetty, if she would consent to see him, because he thought the meeting might possibly be a good to her, might help to melt away this terrible hardness they told him of. If she saw he bore her no ill will for what she had done to him, she might open her heart to him. But this resolution had been an immense effort. He trembled at the thought of seeing her changed face, as a timid woman trembles at the thought of the surgeon's knife, and he chose now to bear the long hours of suspense rather than encounter what seemed to him the more intolerable agony of witnessing her trial. Deep, unspeakable suffering may well be called a baptism, a regeneration, the initiation into a new state. The yearning memories, the bitter regret, the agonized sympathy, the struggling appeals to the invisible right, all the intense emotions which had filled the days and nights of the past week, and were compressing themselves again like an eager crowd into the hours of this single morning, made Adam look back on all the previous years as if they had been a dim, sleepy existence, and he had only now awaked to full consciousness. It seemed to him as if he had always before thought it a light thing that men should suffer, as if all that he had himself endured and called sorrow before was only a moment's stroke that had never left a bruise. Doubtless a great anguish may do the work of years, and we may come out from that baptism of fire with a soul full of new awe and new pity. "O God," Adam groaned as he leaned on the table and looked blankly at the face of the watch, "and men have suffered like this before, and poor helpless young things have suffered like her. Such a little while ago, looking so happy and so pretty, kissing 'em all, her grandfather and all of 'em, and they wishing her luck. Oh, my poor, poor Hetty! Dost think on it now?" Adam started and looked round towards the door. Vixen had begun to whimper, and there was a sound of a stick and a lame walk on the stairs. It was Bartle Massey come back. Could it be all over? Bartle entered quietly, and going up to Adam, grasped his hand and said, "I'm just come to look at you, my boy, for the folks are gone out of court for a bit." Adam's heart beat so violently he was unable to speak. He could only return the pressure of his friend's hand, and Bartle, drawing up the other chair, came and sat in front of him, taking off his hat and his spectacles. "That's a thing never happened to me before," he observed, "to go out of the door with my spectacles on. I clean forgot to take 'em off." The old man made this trivial remark, thinking it better not to respond at all to Adam's agitation. He would gather in an indirect way that there was nothing decisive to communicate at present. "And now," he said, rising again, "I must see to your having a bit of the loaf, and some of that wine Mr. Irwine sent this morning. He'll be angry with me if you don't have it. Come now," he went on, bringing forward the bottle and the loaf and pouring some wine into a cup. "I must have a bit and a sup myself. Drink a drop with me, my lad, drink with me." Adam pushed the cup gently away and said entreatingly, "Tell me about it, Mr. Massey, tell me all about it. Was she there? Have they begun?" "Yes, my boy, yes, it's taken all the time since I first went. But they're slow, and there's the counsel they've got for her puts a spoke in the wheel whenever he can, and makes a deal to do with cross-examining the witnesses and quarrelling with the other lawyers. That's all he can do for the money they give him, and it's a big sum, but he's a cute fellow, with an eye that'd pick the needles out of the hay in no time. If a man had got no feelings, it'd be as good as a demonstration to listen to what goes on in court, but a tender heart makes one stupid. I'd have given up figures for ever only to have had some good news to bring to you, my poor lad." "But does it seem to be going against her?" said Adam. "Tell me what they've said. I must know it now. I must know what they have to bring against her." "Why, the chief evidence yet has been the doctors, all but Martin Poyser, poor Martin. Everybody in court felt for him. It was like one sob, the sound they made when he came down again. The worst was when they told him to look at the prisoner at the bar. It was hard work, poor fellow, it was hard work. Adam, my boy, the blow falls heavily on him as well as you. You must help poor Martin, you must show courage. Drink some wine now, and show me you mean to bear it like a man." Bartle had made the right sort of appeal. Adam, with an air of quiet obedience, took up the cup and drank a little. "Tell me how she looked," he said presently. "Frightened, very frightened, when they first brought her in. It was the first sight of the crowd and the judge, poor creatur'. And there's a lot of foolish women in fine clothes, with gewgaws all up their arms, and feathers on their heads, sitting near the judge. They've dressed themselves out in that way, one 'ud think, to be scarecrows and warnings against any man ever meddling with a woman again. They put up their glasses and stared and whispered. But after that she stood like a white image, staring down at her hands and seeming neither to hear nor see anything. And she's as white as a sheet. She didn't speak when they asked her if she'd plead guilty or not guilty, and they pleaded not guilty for her. But when she heard her uncle's name, there seemed to go a shiver right through her, and when they told him to look at her, she hung her head down and cowered, and hid her face in her hands. He'd much ado to speak, poor man, his voice trembled so, and the counsellors, who look as hard as nails mostly, I saw, spared him as much as they could. Mr. Irwine put himself near him and went with him out of court. It's a great thing in a man's life to be able to stand by a neighbour and uphold him in such trouble as that." "God bless him, and you too, Mr. Massey," said Adam in a low voice, laying his hand on Bartle's arm. "Ay, ay, he's good metal. He gives the right ring when you try him, our parson does. A man o' sense, says no more than's needful. He's not one of those that think they can comfort you with chattering, as if folks who stand by and look on knew a deal better what the trouble was than those who have to bear it. I've had to do with such folks in my time, in the south, when I was in trouble myself. Mr. Irwine is to be a witness himself, by and by, on her side, you know, to speak to her character and bringing up." "But the other evidence, does it go hard against her?" said Adam. "What do you think, Mr. Massey? Tell me the truth." "Yes, my lad, yes. The truth is the best thing to tell. It must come at last. The doctor's evidence is heavy on her, is heavy. But she's gone on denying she's had a child from first to last. These poor silly women things. They've not the sense to know it's no use denying what's proved. It'll make against her with the jury, I doubt, her being so obstinate. They may be less for recommending her to mercy, if the verdict's against her. But Mr. Irwine'll leave no stone unturned with the judge, you may rely upon that, Adam." "Is there nobody to stand by her and seem to care for her in the court?" said Adam. "There's the chaplain of the jail sits near her, but he's a sharp, ferrety-faced man, another sort of flesh and blood to Mr. Irwine. They say the jail chaplains are mostly the fag end of the clergy." "There's one man as ought to be there," said Adam bitterly. Presently he drew himself up and looked fixedly out of the window, apparently turning over some new idea in his mind. "Mr. Massey," he said at last, pushing the hair off his forehead, "I'll go back with you. I'll go into court. It's cowardly of me to keep away. I'll stand by her. I'll own her, for all she's been deceitful. They oughtn't to cast her off, her own flesh and blood. We hand folks over to God's mercy and show none ourselves. I used to be hard sometimes. I'll never be hard again. I'll go, Mr. Massey. I'll go with you." There was a decision in Adam's manner which would have prevented Bartle from opposing him, even if he had wished to do so. He only said, "Take a bit then, and another sup, Adam, for the love of me. See, I must stop and eat a morsel. Now you take some." Nerved by an active resolution, Adam took a morsel of bread and drank some wine. He was haggard and unshaven, as he had been yesterday, but he stood upright again, and looked more like the Adam Bede of former days. End of chapter 42. Recording by Tony Ashworth, Brisbane, Australia.
'43 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Belinda Brown of Indianapolis, Indiana. Adam Bede by George Eliot. The verdict. The place fitted up that day as a court of justice was a grand old hall, now destroyed by fire. The midday light that fell on the closed pavement of human heads was shed through a line of high-pointed windows, variegated with the mellow tints of old painted glass. Grim, dusty armour hung in high relief in front of the dark oaken gallery at the farther end, and under the broad arch of the great mullioned windows opposite was spread a curtain of old tapestry covered with dim, melancholy figures, like a dozing, indistinct dream of the past. It was a place that, through the rest of the year, was haunted with the shadowy memories of old kings and queens, unhappy, discrowned, imprisoned. But to-day all those shadows had fled, and not a soul in the vast hall felt the presence of any but a living sorrow, which was quivering in warm hearts. But that sorrow seemed to have made itself feebly felt hitherto. Now, when Adam Bede's tall figure was suddenly seen being ushered to the side of the prisoner's dock, in the broad sunlight of the great hall, among the sleek-shaven faces of other men, the marks of suffering in his face were startling even to Mr. Irwine, who had last seen him in the dim light of his small room, and the neighbours from Hayslope who were present, and who told Hetty Sorrel's story by their firesides in their old age, never forgot to say how much it moved them when Adam Bede, poor fellow, taller by the head than most of the people round him, came into court and took his place by her side. But Hetty did not see him. She was standing in the same position Bartle Massey had described, her hands crossed over each other and her eyes fixed on them. Adam had not dared to look at her in the first moments, but at last, when the attention of the court was withdrawn by the proceedings, he turned his face toward her with a resolution not to shrink. Why did they say she was so changed? In the corpse we love, it is the likeness we see. It is the likeness which makes itself felt the more keenly because someone else was and is not. There they were, the sweet face and neck, with the dark tendrils of hair, the long dark lashes, the rounded cheek, and the pouting lips. Pale and thin, yes, but like Hetty, and only Hetty. Others thought she looked as if some demon had cast a blighting glance upon her, withered up the woman's soul in her, and left only a hard, despairing obstinacy. But the mother's yearning, that completest type of the life in another life, which is the essence of real human love, feels the presence of the cherished child even in the debased, degraded man, and to Adam, this pale, hard-looking culprit was the Hetty who had smiled at him in the garden under the apple-tree boughs. She was that Hetty's corpse, which he had trembled to look at the first time, and then was unwilling to turn away his eyes from. But presently he heard something that compelled him to listen, and made the sense of sight less absorbing. A woman was in the witness-box, a middle-aged woman, who spoke in a firm, distinct voice. She said, "My name is Sarah Stone. I am a widow, and keep a small shop licensed to sell tobacco, snuff, and tea in Church Lane, Stoniton. The prisoner at the bar is the same young woman who came, looking ill and tired, with a basket on her arm, and asking for a lodging at my house on Saturday evening, the 27th of February. She had taken the house for a public, because there was a figure against the door, and when I said I did not take in lodgers, the prisoner began to cry, and said she was too tired to go anywhere else, and she only wanted a bed for one night. At her prettiness, and her condition, and something respectable about her clothes and looks, and the trouble she seemed to be in, made me as I couldn't find it in my heart to send her away at once. I asked her to sit down, and gave her some tea, and asked her where she was going, and where her friends were. She said she was going home to her friends. They were farming folks and a good way off, and she had a long journey that had cost her more money than she expected. So, as she'd hardly any money left in her pocket, and was afraid of going where it would cost her much, she had been obliged to sell most of the things out of her basket, but she'd thankfully give a shilling for a bed. I saw no reason why I shouldn't take the young woman in for the night. I had only one room, but there were 2 beds in it. and I told her she might stay with me. I thought she'd been led wrong and got into trouble, but if she was going to her friends, it would be a good work to keep her out of further harm. The witness then stated that in the night a child was born, and she identified the baby clothes then shown to her as those in which she had herself dressed the child. "Those are the clothes. I made them myself, and had kept them by me ever since my last child was born. I took a deal of trouble both for the child and the mother. I couldn't help taking to the little thing and being anxious about it. I didn't send for a doctor, for there seemed no need. I told the mother in the daytime she must tell me the name of her friends and where they lived, and let me write to them. She said by and by she would write herself, but not to-day. She would have no nay, but she would get up and be dressed, in spite of everything I could say. She said she felt quite strong enough, and it was wonderful what spirit she showed. But I wasn't quite easy what I should do about her, and toward evening I made my mind I'd go, after meeting was over, and speak to our minister about it. I left the house about 8:30 o'clock. I didn't go out at the shop door, but at the back door, which opens into a narrow alley. I've only got the ground floor of the house, and the kitchen and bedroom both look into the alley. I left the prisoner sitting up by the fire in the kitchen with the baby on her lap. She hadn't cried or seemed low at all. I thought she had a strange look with her eyes, and she got a bit flushed toward evenings. I was afraid of the fever, and I thought I'd call and ask an acquaintance of mine, an experienced woman, to come back with me when I went out. It was a very dark night. I didn't fasten the door behind me. There was no lock. It was a latch with a bolt inside, and when there was nobody in the house I always went out at the shop door. But I thought there was no danger in leaving it unfastened that little while. I was longer gone than I meant to be, for I had to wait for the woman that came back with me. It was an hour and a half before we got back, and when we went in, the candle was standing burning just as I left it, but the prisoner and the baby were both gone. She'd taken her cloak and bonnet, but she'd left the basket and the things in it. I was dreadful frightened, and angry with her for going. I didn't go to give information, because I'd no thought that she meant to do any harm, and I knew she had money in her pocket to buy her food and lodging. I didn't like to set the constable after her, for she'd a right to go for me if she liked. The effect of this evidence on Adam was electrical. It gave him a new force. Hetty could not be guilty of the crime. Her heart must have clung to her baby, else why should she have taken it with her? She might have left it behind. The little creature had died naturally, and then she had hidden it. Babies were so liable to death, and there might be the strongest suspicions without any proof of guilt. His mind was so occupied with imaginary arguments against such suspicions that he could not listen to the cross-examination by Hetty's counsel, who tried, without result, to elicit evidence that the prisoner had shown some movements of maternal affection towards the child. The whole time this witness was being examined, Hetty had stood as motionless as before. No word seemed to arrest her ear, but the sound of the next witness's voice touched a chord that was still sensitive. She gave a start and a frightened look towards him, but immediately turned away her head and looked down at her hands as before. This witness was a man, a rough peasant. He said, "My name is John Olding. I am a labourer, and I live at Ted's Hole, 2 miles out of Stonyton. A week last Monday, toward 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I was going toward Hetton Coppice, and about a quarter of a mile from the coppice I saw the prisoner, in a red cloak, sitting under a bit of a haystack not far off the stile. She got up when she saw me, and seemed as if she'd be walking on the other way. It was a regular road through the fields, and nothing very uncommon to see a young woman there, but I took notice of her because she looked white and scared. I should have thought she was a beggar woman, only for her good clothes. I thought she looked a bit crazy, but it was no business of mine. I stood and looked back at her, but she went right on while she was in sight. I had to go to the other side of the coppice to look after some stakes. There's a road right through it, and bits of opening here and there, where the trees have been cut down, and some of 'em not carried away. I didn't go straight along the road, but turned off toward the middle and took a shorter way towards the spot I wanted to get to. I hadn't got far out of the road into one of the open places before I heard a strange cry. I thought it didn't come from any animal I knew, but I wasn't for stopping to look about just then. But it went on, and seemed so strange to me in that place, I couldn't help stopping to look. I began to think I might make some money of it, if it was a new thing. But I had hard work to tell which way it came from, and for a good while I kept looking up at the boughs. And then I thought it came from the ground, and there was a lot of timber choppings lying about, and loose pieces of turf, and a trunk or two. And I looked about among them, but could find nothing, and at last the cry stopped. So I was for giving it up, and I went on about my business. But when I came back the same way, pretty nigh an hour after, I couldn't help laying down my stakes to have another look. And just as I was stooping and laying down the stakes, I saw something odd, round, and whitish lying on the ground under a nut bush by the side of me. And I stooped down on hands and knees to pick it up, and I saw it was a little baby's hand. At these words a thrill ran through the court. Hetty was visibly trembling. Now, for the first time, she seemed to be listening to what the witness said. There was a lot of timber choppings put together just where the ground went hollow, like under the bush, and the hand came out from among them. But there was a hole left in one place, and I could see down it, and see the child's head. And I made haste, and did away the turf and the choppings, and took out the child. It had got comfortable clothes on, but its body was cold, and I thought it must be dead. I made haste back with it out of the woods, and took it home to my wife. She said it was dead, and I'd better take it to the parish and tell the constable. And I said, I'll lay my life it's that young woman's child as I met going to the coppice. But she seemed to be gone clean out of sight, and I took the child on to Hetton parish, and told the constable, and we went on to Justice Hardy. And then we went looking after the young woman till dark at night, and we went and gave information at Stoniton as they might stop her. And the next morning another constable came to me to go with him to the spot where I found the child. And when we got there, there was the prisoner sitting against the bush where I found the child. And she cried out when she saw us, but she never offered to move. She'd got a big piece of bread on her lap. Adam had given a faint groan of despair while this witness was speaking. He had hidden his face on his arm, which rested on the boarding in front of him. It was the supreme moment of his suffering. Hetty was guilty, and he was silently calling to God for help. He heard no more of the evidence, and was unconscious when the case for the prosecution had closed. Unconscious that Mr. Irwine was in the witness box, telling of Hetty's unblemished character in her own parish, and of the virtuous habits in which she had been brought up. This testimony could have no influence on the verdict, but it was given as part of the plea for mercy which her own counsel would have made if he had been allowed to speak for her, a favour not granted to criminals in those stern times. At last Adam lifted up his head, for there was general movement round him. The judge had addressed the jury, and they were retiring. The decisive moment was not far off. Adam felt a shuddering horror that would not let him look at Hetty, but she had long relapsed into her blank, hard indifference. All eyes were strained to look at her, but she stood like a statue of dull despair. There was a mingled rustling, whispering, and low buzzing throughout the court during this interval. The desire to listen was suspended, and every one had some feeling or opinion to express in undertones. Adam sat looking blankly before him, but he did not see the objects that were right in front of his eyes. The counsel and attorneys talking with an air of cool business, and Mr. Irwine in low, earnest conversation with the judge, did not see Mr. Irwine sit down again in agitation and shake his head mournfully when somebody whispered to him. The inward action was too intense for Adam to take in outward objects until some strong sensation roused him. It was not very long, hardly more than a quarter of an hour, before the knock which told that the jury had come to their decision fell as a signal for silence on every ear. It is sublime, that sudden pause of a great multitude which tells that one soul moves in them all. Deeper and deeper The silence seemed to become like the deepening night, while the jurymen's names were called over, and the prisoner was made to hold up her hand, and the jury were asked for their verdict. Guilty. It was the verdict every one expected, but there was a sigh of disappointment from some hearts that it was followed by no recommendation to mercy. Still, the sympathy of the court was not with the prisoner. The unnaturalness of her crime stood out the more harshly by the side of her hard immovability and obstinate silence. Even the verdict, to distant eyes, had not appeared to move her, but those who were near saw her trembling. The stillness was less intense until the judge put on his black cap, and the chaplain his canonicals was observed behind him. Then it deepened again, before the crier had time to command silence. If any sound were heard, it must have been the sound of beating hearts. The judge spoke. "Hetty Sorrel." The blood rushed to Hetty's face, and then fled back again as she looked up at the judge, and kept her wide open eyes fixed on him as if fascinated by fear. Adam had not yet turned towards her. There was a deep horror, like a great gulf between them. But at the words, "and then to be hanged by the neck till you're dead," a piercing shriek ran through the hall. It was Hetty's shriek. Adam started to his feet and stretched out his arms toward her, but the arms could not reach her. She had fallen down in a fainting fit, and was carried out of court. End of chapter 43. Recording by Belinda Brown of Indianapolis, Indiana. Chapter 44 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Belinda Brown of Indianapolis, Indiana. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Arthur's Return. When Arthur Donnithorne landed at Liverpool and read the letter from his Aunt Lydia, briefly announcing his grandfather's death, his first feeling was, "Poor grandfather, I wish I could have got to him to be with him when he died." He might have felt or wished something at last that I shall never know now. It was a lonely death. It is impossible to say that his grief was deeper than that. Pity and softened memory took place of the old antagonism, and in his busy thoughts about the future, as the chaise carried him rapidly along towards the home where he was now to be master, there was a continually recurring effort to remember anything by which he could show a regard for his grandfather's wishes, without counteracting his own cherished aims for the good of the tenants and the estate. But it is not in human nature, only in human pretence, for a young man like Arthur, with a fine constitution and fine spirits, thinking well of himself, believing that others think well of him, and having a very ardent intention to give them more and more reason for that opinion. It is not possible for such a young man, just coming into a splendid estate through the death of a very old man whom he was not fond of, to believe anything very different from exultant joy. Now his real life was beginning. Now he would have room and opportunity for action, and he would use them. He would show the Loamshire people what a fine country gentleman he was. He would not exchange this career for any other under the sun. He felt himself riding over the hills in a breezy autumn days, looking after favourite plans of drainage and enclosure, then admired on sombre mornings as the best rider on the best horse in the hunt, spoken well of on market day as a first-rate landlord, by and by making speeches at election dinners, and showing a wonderful knowledge of agriculture, the patron of new ploughs and drills, the severe upbraider of negligent landowners, and withal a jolly fellow that every one must like. Happy faces greeted him everywhere on his own estate, and the neighbouring families on the best terms with him. The Irwines should dine with him every week, and have their own carriage to come in, for in some very delicate way that Arthur would devise, the lay improprietor of the Hayslope tithes would insist on paying a couple of hundred more to the vicar, and his aunt should be as comfortable as possible, and go on living at the Chase, if she liked, in spite of her old maidish ways, at least until he was married. And that event lay in the indistinct background, for Arthur had not yet seen the woman who would play the lady wife to the first-rate country gentleman. These were Arthur's chief thoughts, so far as a man's thoughts through hours of travelling can be compressed into a few sentences, which are only like the list of names telling you what are the scenes in a long, long panorama full of colour, of detail, and of life. The happy faces Arthur saw greeting him were not pale abstractions, but real ruddy faces, long familiar to him. Martin Poyser was there, and the whole Poyser family. What? Hetty? Yes, for Arthur was at ease about Hetty. Not quite at ease about the past, for a certain burning of the ears would come whenever he thought of the scenes with Adam last August, but at ease about her present lot. Mr. Irwine, who had been a regular correspondent, telling him all the news about the old places and people, had sent him a word nearly 3 months ago that Adam Bede was not to marry Mary Burge, as he had thought, but pretty Hetty Sorrel. Martin Poyser and Adam himself had both told Mr. Irwine all about it, that Adam had been deeply in love with Hetty these 2 years, and that now it was agreed they were to be married in March. That stalwart rogue, Adam, was more susceptible than the rector had thought. It was really quite an idyllic love affair, and if it had not been too long to tell in a letter, he would have liked to describe to Arthur the blushing looks and the simple strong words with which the fine honest fellow told his secret. He knew Arthur would like to hear that Adam had this sort of happiness in prospect. Yes, indeed, Arthur felt that there was not air enough in the room to satisfy his renovated life. When he had read that passage in the letter, he threw up the window. He rushed out of doors into the December air, and greeted every one who spoke to him with an eager gaiety, as if there had been news of a fresh Nelson victory. For the first time that day since he had come to Windsor, he was in true boyish spirits. The load that had been pressing upon him was gone. The haunting fear had vanished. He thought he could conquer his bitterness toward Adam now, could offer him his hand, and ask to be his friend again, in spite of that painful memory which would still make his ears burn. He had been knocked down, and he had been forced to tell a lie. Such things make a scar, do what we will. But if Adam were the same again, as in the old days, Arthur wished to be the same too, and to have Adam mixed up with his business and his future, as he had always desired before the accursed meeting in August. Nay, he would do a great deal more for Adam than he should otherwise have done when he came into the estate. Hetty's husband had a special claim on him. Hetty herself should feel that any pain she had suffered through Arthur in the past was compensated to her 100-fold, for really she could not have felt much, since she had so soon made up her mind to marry Adam. You perceive clearly what sort of picture Adam and Hetty made in the panorama of Arthur's thoughts on his journey homeward. It was March now. They were soon to be married. Perhaps they were already married. And now it was actually in his power to do a great deal for them. Sweet, sweet little Hetty. The little puss hadn't cared for him half as much as he cared for her, for he was a great fool about her still, was almost afraid of seeing her. Indeed, had not cared much to look at any other woman since he parted from her. That little figure coming towards him in the grove, those dark French childish eyes, the lovely lips put up to kiss him, that picture had got no fainter with the lapse of months, and she would look just the same. It was impossible to think how he could meet her. He should certainly tremble. Strange how long this sort of influence lasts, for he was certainly not in love with Hetty now. He had been earnestly desiring, for months, that she should marry Adam, and there was nothing that contributed more to his happiness in these moments than the thought of their marriage. It was the exaggerating effect of imagination that made his heart still beat a little more quickly at the thought of her. When he saw the little thing again, as she really was, as Adam's wife, at work quite prosaically in her new home, he should perhaps wonder at the possibility of his past feelings. Thank heaven it had turned out so well. He should have plenty of affairs and interests to fill his life now, and not be in danger of playing the fool again. Pleasant the crack of the post-boy's whip, pleasant the sense of being hurried along in a swift ease through English scenes, so like those round his own home, only not quite so charming. Here was a market town, very much like Treddleston, where the arms of the neighbouring lord of the manor were borne on a sign of the principal inn. Then mere fields and hedges, their vicinity to a market town carrying an agreeable suggestion of high rent, till the land began to assume a trimmer look. The woods were more frequent, and at length a white or red mansion looked down from a moderate eminence, or allowed him to be aware of its parapet and chimneys among the dense-looking masses of oaks and elms, masses reddened now with early buds, and close at hand came the village, the small church with its red-tiled roof, looking humble even among the faded half-timbered houses, the old green gravestones with nettles round them, nothing fresh and bright but the children, opening round eyes at the swift post-chaise, nothing noisy and busy but the gaping curs of mysterious pedigree. What a much prettier village Hayslope was, and it should not be neglected like this place. Vigorous repairs should go on everywhere among farm buildings and cottages, and travellers in post-chaises coming along the Rossiter road should do nothing but admire as they went, and Adam Bede should be superintendent of all repairs, for he had a share in Burge's business now, and, if he liked, Arthur would put some money into the concern and buy the old man out in another year or two. That was an ugly fault in Arthur's life, that affair last summer, but the future should make amends. Many men would have retained a feeling of vindictiveness toward Adam, but he would not. He would resolutely overcome all littleness of that kind, for he had certainly been very much in the wrong, and though Adam had been harsh and violent, and had thrust on him a painful dilemma, the poor fellow was in love, and had real provocation. No, Arthur had not an evil feeling in his mind towards any human being. He was happy, and would make every one else happy that came within his reach. And here was dear old Hayslope at last, sleeping on the hill like a quiet old place as it was, in the late afternoon sunlight, and opposite to it the great shoulders of the Benton hills, below them the purplish blackness of the hanging woods, and at last the pale front of the Abbey, looking out from among the oaks of the Chase, as if anxious for the heir's return. Poor grandfather, and he lies dead there. He was a young fellow once, coming into the estate and making his plans. So the world goes round. Aunt Lydia must feel very desolate, poor thing, but she shall be indulged as much as she indulges her fat Fido. The wheels of Arthur's chaise had been anxiously listened for at the Chase, for to-day was Friday, and the funeral had already been deferred 2 days. Before it drew up on the gravel of the courtyard, all servants in the house were assembled to receive him with a grave, decent welcome, befitting a house of death. A month ago, perhaps, it would have been difficult for them to have maintained a suitable sadness in their faces when Mr. Arthur was come to take possession. But the hearts of the head servants were heavy that day for another cause than the death of the old squire, and more than one of them was longing to be 20 miles away, as Mr. Craig was, knowing what was to become of Hetty Sorrel, pretty Hetty Sorrel, whom they used to see every week. They had the partisanship of household servants, who liked their places, and were not inclined to go the full length of the severe indignation felt against him by the farming tenants, but rather to make excuses for him. Nevertheless, the upper servants, who had been on terms of neighbourly intercourse with the Poysers for many years, could not help feeling that the longed-for event of the young squire's coming into the estate had been robbed of all its pleasantness. To Arthur It was nothing surprising that the servants looked grave and sad. He himself was very much touched on seeing them all again, and feeling that he was in a new relation to them. It was that sort of pathetic emotion which has more pleasure than pain in it, which is perhaps one of the most delicious of all states to a good-natured man, conscious of the power to satisfy his good nature. His heart swelled agreeably as he said, "Well, Mills, how's my aunt?" But now Mr. Bygate, the lawyer, who had been in the house ever since the death, came forward to give deferential greetings and answer all questions, and Arthur walked with him towards the library, where his Aunt Lydia was expecting him. Aunt Lydia was the only person in the house who knew nothing about Hetty. Her sorrow as a maiden daughter was unmixed with any other thoughts than those of anxiety about funeral arrangements and her own future lot, and, after the manner of women, she mourned for the father who had made her life important, all the more because she had a secret sense that there was little mourning for him in other hearts. But Arthur kissed her tearful face more tenderly than he had ever done in his life before. "Dear aunt," he said affectionately as he held her hand, "your loss is the greatest of all, but you must tell me how to try and make it up to you all the rest of your life." "It was so sudden and so dreadful, Arthur," poor Miss Lydia began, pouring out her little plaints, and Arthur sat down to listen with impatient patience. When a pause came, he said, "Now, aunt, I'll leave you for a quarter of an hour, just to go to my own room, and then I shall come and give full attention to everything." "My room is all ready for me, I suppose, Mills?" he said to the butler, who seemed to be lingering uneasily about the entrance hall. "Yes, sir, and there are letters for you. They are all laid out on the writing table in your dressing room." On entering the small ante-room, which was called a dressing room, but which Arthur really used only to lounge and write in, he just cast his eyes on the writing table, and saw that there were several letters and packets lying there. But he was in the uncomfortable dusty condition of a man who had a long hurried journey, and he must really refresh himself by attending to his toilette a little before he read his letters. Pym was there, making everything ready for him, and soon, with a delightful freshness about him, as if he were prepared to begin a new day, he went back into his dressing room to open his letters. The level rays of the low afternoon sun entered directly at the window, and as Arthur seated himself in his velvet chair, with their pleasant warmth upon him, he was conscious of that quiet well-being which perhaps you and I have felt on a sunny afternoon, when, in our brightest youth and health, life has opened a new vista for us, and long to-morrows of activity have stretched before us like a lovely plain, which there was no need for hurrying to look at, because it was all our own. The top letter was placed with its address upwards. It was Mr. Irwine's handwriting. Arthur saw at once, and below the address was written, "To be delivered as soon as he arrives." Nothing could have been less surprising to him than a letter from Mr. Irwine at that moment. Of course, there was something he wished Arthur to know earlier than it was possible for them to see each other. At such a time as that it was quite natural that Irwine should have something pressing to say. Arthur broke the seal with an agreeable anticipation of soon seeing the writer. "I send this letter to meet you on your arrival, Arthur, because I may then be at Stonington, whither I am called by the most painful duty it has ever been given me to perform, and it is right that you should know what I have to tell you without delay. I will not attempt to add one word of reproach to the retribution that is now falling on you. In other words that I could write at this moment must be weak and unmeaning by the side of those in which I must tell you the simple fact. Hetty Sorrel is in prison, and will be tried on Friday for the crime of child murder." Arthur read no more. He started up from his chair, and stood for a single minute with a sense of violent convulsion in his whole frame, as if the life were going out of him with horrible throbs. But the next minute he had rushed out of the room, still clutching the letter. He was hurrying along the corridor and down the stairs into the hall. Mills was there, but Arthur did not see him, as he passed like a hunted man across the hall and out along the gravel. The butler hurried out after him as fast as his elderly limbs could run. He guessed, he knew where the young squire was going. When Mills got to the stables, a horse was being saddled, and Arthur was forcing himself to read the remaining words of the letter. He thrust it into his pocket as the horse was led up to him, and at that moment caught sight of Mill's anxious face in front of him. "Tell them I'm gone to Stonington," he said in a muffled tone of agitation, sprang into the saddle, and set off at a gallop. End of chapter 44. Recording by Belinda Brown of Indianapolis, Indiana.